one of the innovations that I hope will continue, that I think has been most successful in terms of public program, has been the Foro Urgente. And that's because it allows us to be on record engaging precisely that question on an ongoing basis. And I think, in other words, every 6 months saying what's happening in Latin America that we need to both mobilize expertise, contribute to the debate, raise public awareness, and be relevant as an institution that not only does deep contextualized long-term research, but also has something to say about contemporary issues. And I think, so the series of, I think back on the series of topics, from the very first one on the ousting of Zelaya in Honduras to child migrants and deportation to Venezuela crisis to Cuba, all Brazil. We've the whole series of issues on Mexico and the protests around the elections, 132. I mean, there's been a series of really memorable photos, and I think what Paloma innovated was to increase the possibilities by also drawing more on local faculty, our own faculty, as opposed to just having them be invited guests. And I think that was really good. So that one thing that raises is just the possibility or the priority or the principle that Lilas Benson needs to be on record when important things are happening in the region. And that's something that, I think has always been an aspiration, but I think the Foro Urgente doesn't resolve the problem. There's lots of more that needs to be done in that regard in terms of having a public voice and having a media presence and so forth, but I think that's at least moving us in that direction. I think also, in terms of what's been happening in the region, it's been a really interesting time. It always is. One thing that comes to mind toward the beginning of my tenure, I really started engaging Brazil for the first time, and I have to say that's one of my biggest learning curves, was not speaking Portuguese and not having really spent much time at all in Brazil before the directorship. And I started going much more frequently, and the beginning years was in the Brazilian boom. And so I have this this image of going into a government ministry and them, kind of almost taunting us, saying, we have a lot of money to put on the table for education. What are you all contributing? And this kind of reversal of the role between North and South, that was really, I thought, very exciting in a way, sort of the opportunity to partner with a country that's actually, at that time, was investing much more in higher education than our own country was. And so there's a sense of the Brazilian economic dynamism was very, very powerful, and political presence in the world was a very big deal for the first years, combined with the troubling aspects of that model, both in terms of development, the development model, the underlying contradictions of the Brazilian development model, and also issues like state violence, anti-black violence, which we did a lot with here in Lilas. I think really coming to terms with some of the complexities of the Brazilian transformation in that era, I think has been something that has had a big importance for me. The other, I suppose, historically, what's framed my directorship has been Obama. I remember I was in Mexico when Obama was elected, and there was an enormous outpouring of enthusiasm among Mexicans for the first time we're going to have a president that really cares about us and that has a kind of a progressive outlook that we can identify with. And then, obviously a lot of disillusionment, particularly I think around immigration policy, which has been a big disappointment. And that connects with, the whole, the militarization of the border and deportation, which is another issue that's, I feel like, has been very present for Lilas. And then the other bookend is, the kinds of things that Obama's been doing recently. And I think of the Cuba normalization as a huge, kind of milestone in U.S. Latin American relations and obviously in internal Cuban society, and one that I think this relates to the previous question. That's Lilas historically has had a big relationship to Cuba. I think we've had a little less in this period, and it's a time of great change and of great need for strong relationships. One final theme that's been very present. I'm not sure it's affected our priorities so much, but just an issue that we've been, I think, really grappling with a lot, and that is kind of how Lilas as a teaching and academic center should deal with the levels of horrific violence that have been afflicting many parts of, not all parts of Latin America, but certainly many areas. I'm thinking of the Ayotzinapa killings. I'm thinking of the level of violence in general in Mexico and Central America. That's one of the big factors that's produced the child migrants, and the kind of we've done a lot of conferences that have focused on those issues, workshops. There's a lot of students that are very interested. I think we're still some very interesting initiatives around narration, combination of journalists and social science work on the topic. But it's such a challenging one, and one of the challenges that I think of as being most something that touches on a priority of the Institute that probably is more for the future than something we've actually dealt with, is in most of these violence, intense discussions about violence, the conversation at some point turns to how the violence also affects the people, at least in a secondary way, the people that are actually studying and teaching on it, and how in some ways this is a topic that needs to incorporate some different ethos of care for the teachers and researchers and students, and that's opens onto a whole series of issues that I think are very important and we don't really yet have a handle on. I was very moved by her job talk. To the point where I wouldn't have ever. If someone had told me you would get emotional about a job talk on archives, I would say, but it was very intense what she was saying, and it was about that. It was about caring for documents, which is the archival mission. But how can we care for documents in a way that also cares for the communities that produce those documents, particularly in human rights situations? We're talking about tremendous vulnerabilities and social suffering. And so what does an archival program look like that actually thinks about caring in that broader sense of connecting with the communities? And I think her third point was then it's the archival counterpart to what I just said, that the people who are actually processing the documents need to be cared for too, because it's very intense. And the example that comes to mind there is one of these archives of memory, the police archives in Guatemala, the archives in Chile and in Argentina and many countries that are documenting documenting periods of intense political violence. The people that are putting together those archives and processing the materials are reliving the violence that was committed against often family members or friends or people that they know, or just their own society. And so there's this kind of notion of the archival endeavor that all of a sudden reaches out in all these ways that you just didn't think about. And I loved it that her talk kind of embodied, I think, the broader principle of Lelas Benson, because it gets into all these other areas that aren't strictly speaking archival, and also another aspect of what we've kind of stood for in recent years. That is that an institution like this has to have a social conscience. It has to have some kind of sense of social purpose beyond or as part of the educational endeavor, and I think she really embodied that nicely. I always start out saying that it's not about being an activist as much as it is about applying certain kinds of principles that come from our conscience in the world, and applying them in an active and transformative way to the practice of academia and practice of archives. So I like the term archivist. I have no idea if anyone would actually own that term, and activist scholar is one that's constantly debated. But I think if we think of it in that way, what we're thinking about is activist more as an adjective. That's something that's working on those nouns rather than as a noun itself. And also keeping it very pluralist, so that there's a sense, this is not about a political line that we're trying to advance. It's about a different kind of practice of of our profession. And in that sense, I think one of the things we've done in the graduate program is really sharpen the principles of Latin American studies, and that is we insist on interdisciplinarity. We really want students to come to Lelas to study topics in ways that they couldn't do in disciplines, by combining different tools and different approaches and different theories. And that always creates it creates an unsettling, but it's very productive. Secondly, we do have an ethos that I hope will continue, and that's been very, I think, important to the last couple of years of administrators call it diversity. You can also call it justice, racial justice, gender justice, sort of a sense of paying attention to what voices and what bodies are present in the classroom and in each graduate class, and making sure that composition reflects our broader principles. And then the third is research and teaching with an impact, with a kind of an ethos of social engagement. And those three come together in lots of different ways, and some emphasize some more than others, and we're always concerned with academic excellence in combination with those three. But I think the more we can differentiate ourselves in that way and say, this is what we do really well, and we're not trying to imitate kind of conventional disciplines. We're trying to be something different, and something that will not be to the taste of everyone, but that will really fill a niche that there's a demand for. I think that will be a key ingredient of our success. Latin American studies is thriving in the sense of scholars studying Latin America, but vibrant spaces of Latin American studies training, in the sense that I just described, are actually shrinking. And so we have to defend that space and continue to articulate the vision, and I think that will place us really more and more in a class of our own.